Hello, I'm Annette Young and welcome to the 51%, a show about women reshaping our world, and more importantly, welcome to our 10th anniversary edition. And yes, it's hard to believe, it's a decade since we started this program, the only show of its kind on a global newscaster. To mark our 10th birthday, I'm joined by three wonderful guests, all of whom have been on the program before, to take a look back at the progress or otherwise of women's rights since 2013. Joining me from New York is Anita Bhatia, the founder of Impact Commons and also the former Assistant Secretary General and Deputy Executive Director at UN Women. From Kiev, Anya Neistat, the Legal Director at the Clooney Foundation for Justice, and here with me in the studio in Paris, Rebecca Amsellem, a French-Canadian feminist activist and creator of Les Glorieuses newsletter. Thanks to all of you for being here today. But first, and starting with Anita, I want to ask the three of you about what struck you personally the most about women's rights in the last decade. Anita Bhatia.
First of all, congratulations on the 10th anniversary, a wonderful accomplishment. And thank you for the question about what has really struck me personally about progress or lack of it in the last 10 years. I would say the thing that really stands out to me is the horrifying prospect that my daughter may have less rights than I did at her age. And that's really principally related to the pushback that we're seeing on women's rights in the US on reproductive rights, but in other parts of the world as well. So while there's been huge amounts of progress in certain areas of women's rights, education, maternal mortality, leadership, representation, the fact is the pushback against women's rights has never been louder.
And Anya, in Kiev, what are your thoughts?
Well, I think Anita put it very well. For me, it's also this massive disparity between all the progress that has been made and yet worrying about the same thing, whether my daughter, who's still very young, would have less rights than I do. And honestly, it's across the board, whether we look at sexual violence in conflict, something that I work a lot on, or whether we look at countries like Afghanistan, where it seems to be largely forgotten by the world right now, but it's actually still hard to believe what's happening pretty much as we watch. And of course, as Anita mentioned, countries like the United States, where it's a massive, massive movement backwards, which doesn't seem to stop.
Rebecca?
Well, I would say that 10 years ago, feminism for me was a feeling. It was a feeling that something wasn't right with the society. The fact that I was walking on the street, feeling scared all the time, that something might happen, or that sometimes stuff actually happened. But I couldn't put a word on it because I didn't have, I would say, at school, the education to tell me that what was wrong with the society. And I would say that now, 10 years later, I know what's wrong, and I know so many people, you among all of them, working on an everyday basis to fight this patriarchy.
Now let's focus on political power. Anita, you and I spoke at the height of the pandemic about how female leaders in power back then did a markedly better job in navigating their nations through this global crisis. Now, figures show that women in positions of political power are still very low in 2023, as you can see in this graphic. So what will it take to boost the numbers of women in power?
Well, I think you need a couple of things. From a public policy perspective, we need more countries to insist on having quotas for women in parliament, and we need more enlightened leadership, particularly by men, because without male allies, this isn't going to change. We need more advocacy around the role of women in positions of power. And, you know, it is pretty shocking that we had the first CEO, female CEO on Wall Street only 5 years ago, and we've just now had the first head of a Big Four accounting firm. So, you know, we're still living in a world where we're saying the first woman. That needs to change. We should be able to take for granted that women occupy positions of power, whether in the private sector or public sector, without batting an eyelid.
Anya, we now have two conflicts, one in Ukraine and the other in the Middle East, which have the distinct danger of spiralling out into a global scenario. a simplistic question maybe, but if we had far more women as heads of state in charge of the UN or just generally in positions of political power, would we be in this position?
It's a good question, and there is research showing that women in position of power do help to reduce the levels of violence and the level of the prospects of peace agreements. There are quite a few examples from Africa where women leading peace movements actually did manage to achieve results that men could not. But I also think it's not just women in leadership. It's about the whole concept of feminist internal policy and feminist foreign policy. And it's really very difficult to disconnect what's happening on the ground to women who are being raped or abused domestically and the lack of women in position of power. These are all really parts of the same chain and the same problem.
Rebecca, here in France, we have yet to still see a female president. Do you think that's going to happen within your lifetime?
I hope it's not going to happen in a few years to come, to be honest, because the woman who's most likely to become president here is Marine Le Pen, and she's the representative of the far-right party. She's here because her father created this party, and she is a danger to women. When we talk about what the far-right party is doing to women in general, we can just see what's happening in Italy right now. It's a woman who's at the head of the state, Giorgia Meloni, and she recently revoked parental rights for lesbian mothers, for instance. I think a few days back, she revoked minimum wage. And who's going to suffer from the lack of minimum wage? Mothers, single mothers, women in general who are already being paid less than men. So if I think about having a woman president in France, that would be amazing if she champions women's rights.
Moving on now to reproductive rights. Back in December 2019, we were in Senegal, where we joined reproductive rights activists working hard to spread the word in the West African nation. In Senegal, family planning consultations are in principle offered free of charge in all medical centres. At the Peking Mothers and Babies Clinic, the staff find themselves on the front line in the battle to promote contraception. But for this 24-year-old teacher, a consultation is nothing to be ashamed of. On the contrary, it's about taking control of your destiny.
It gives young women more autonomy so that they will at last have the same rights as men here in Senegal.
So how do men react to this?
Well, they don't agree with it. Maybe they're just jealous. But I think we can get there all the same, because girls today are so brave. I think they will manage to succeed in the end.
Rebecca, we see there the importance of empowering women when it comes to reproductive rights and their choices, but sadly that is still not the case in many parts of the world, is it?
Definitely. I think that the war against women bodies and the right for women to choose what they want to do with their bodies is the oldest. And I think that the fight for reproductive rights is the fight for dignity, and it's a human rights. And this is something that we need to stress out. It's not only a women issue, it's a human issue.
And for many, the US Supreme Court's decision to roll back Roe v. Wade in 2022 was seen as a devastating setback to women's reproductive autonomy and a fundamental violation of human rights. A few months later, we were in the southern state of Kentucky reporting on the impact of that decision.
During the overturn of Roe v. Wade, and actually after, I was raped, and had I not gone to the ER and sought help and been given the emergency contraceptive, it became real to me that I would then not have the choice.
You would not have been able to have an abortion?
I would not have been able to have an abortion. I was still I would have been 5 weeks. And then carrying a child by my rapist would have been emotionally hard. But I don't know how I could have mentally carried a baby full term, and how I could be a mother.
Anita, this decision is not only a critical setback for women's rights in the US, but it also has global implications, doesn't it?
It does, because when something happens in the US, which is so monumental, as was the judgment in Dobbs versus Jackson overturning Roe v. Wade, it does reverberate around the world, and it gives added momentum to anti-choice groups. And as Rebecca said, this is a fundamental question of human rights. It's a question of basic healthcare, and it is a question of equity. It is hard to think of a single area where men have to do something, or there is control over men's bodies in the way society seeks to put control over women's bodies. So obviously, given that there are very well-funded anti-choice movements all over the world, if something happens in the US, those groups, whether they are in Nicaragua or in Poland, have added fuel for their fire to say, we need to control women's rights, and women do not have bodily autonomy.
Now, turning our attention to ending violence against women and girls. In 2017, we were in Buenos Aires in Argentina to meet members of Ni Una Menos movement, or in English, Not One Less, which has been campaigning since 2015 to end violence against both women and girls. 14 out of the 25 nations with the highest rates of gender-based violence can be found in Latin America. Let's hear what one of its members, Jimena Shinka, said when asked why Latin America had such a problem.
The problem is an education that is based that women are objects that can be used to reproduce humanity or used for consuming. The roots are in the education and in the culture. But the problem is an everyday problem in our own homes, on the streets, when a man feels that he have the right to say anything to a woman on the street. It's an expression of violence against women. It's an expression of gender violence in a more symbolic way.
Argentinian journalist Jimena Shinka talking to us back in 2017 about femicide. Anya, violence against women and girls is a massive global problem. However, as an investigator of war crimes, we know how rape is used as a weapon of war. But just how hard is it to investigate and prosecute such crimes?
It is very hard to investigate. In most societies, there is absolute stigma attached to the idea of being sexually abused. And so very few, to this day, very few witnesses come ahead, and sometimes they come forward years after something has happened, and that makes it almost impossible to carry out a proper investigation and prosecution. Moreover, if we look at the number of cases, war crime cases being prosecuted around the world, the percentage of cases amongst them that concern violence against women is still very, very small. I can tell you that many of the prosecutors and investigators here in Ukraine and elsewhere also are not familiar and not very well trained to deal with such cases. And we have situations where women do come forward, but after one conversation with an investigator, a policeman, a prosecutor, they decide to drop the case because they're not being treated properly, not being protected, not being provided psychological support. So it's really a conundrum of problems that does not allow us often to bring the perpetrators to justice.
Rebecca, in regards to violence against women, let's talk now about the biggest movement in feminism in the last 10 years, and that, of course, being the Me Too movement. And we're still seeing the impact to this very day, aren't we?
Absolutely, especially in France, since American culture is very present, and the women who came forward in America were mostly actresses and women in power. So we'll still see the possibility of Me Too happening in France. I'm just saying that I'm not sure it already happened, because the structure of power, the patriarchy, is so powerful in France that it really is behind all those men having all those horrible behavior towards women. And talking about violence against women, we need to talk about economic issues. We need to talk about money. Until women are not paid the same weight as men, they won't have the possibility to talk, to come forward, to move if they need to move. And this is why we recently did a campaign here in France to fight against economic violences, and especially against economic violences in couples.
And Anita, recently the situation in Iran and Afghanistan for women has become incredibly horrific. There's now a push to make the definition of apartheid under international law to recognise gender apartheid. Is that likely to happen?
You know, it may happen, but I think the issue really is not so much whether this becomes something that is part of international law and leads to prosecution. Let's face it, Afghanistan and Iran, the situation of women's rights there is one of the great tragedies of our times. And what we need is many more voices in the international community asking for prosecution of this, if this is recognized as apartheid. But importantly, we need to make sure that we do not fall into the morally bankrupt position of saying we must recognize the Taliban or give them legitimacy. This is absolutely unacceptable in my view. And I think the world needs to remember Afghanistan and Iran. The problem is that everybody's bandwidth is limited, and Afghanistan has fallen off the radar for so many people. Let us not forget that Afghanistan and Iran are epitomizing the pushback against women's rights today.
Finally, a question to all three of you. Where should the world be 10 years from now when it comes to women's rights, and what is possible to achieve and what is not?
One wish would be to not have this conversation 10 years from now, at least around the same subjects. I really think we should be in a different place. It's impossible to solve all the problems in 10 years, but at least to not have them as the top of our agenda as women's rights activists would be a good start. And then, of course, in terms of what's possible, I do think that laws are there, at least internationally. It's all about implementation, and implementation is both about leadership, awareness, and activism. And if these three components come together, we will probably be in a different place 10 years from now.
Anita, your thoughts?
So my wish list would be one, I'd like to see WHO declare violence against women a pandemic, because this is a problem hiding in plain sight. We've become so inured to it that we're not really doing much to address it. So I'd like to see that change. I'd like to see equal pay for women globally, worldwide, in the public sector, in the private sector. I'd like to see many more men taking up this issue, because this is something for all of society, and particularly young men who feel very disempowered today. We need many more male allies in this fight, because gender is a macro-critical issue. It matters for all of society, not just for women. And finally, given the biggest existential threat that we face, which is climate change, I really would like to see gender considerations mainstreamed into all discussions of public policy, not just in climate change, but anything we do should be looked at through a gender intentional lens.
Rebecca, your final words?
Anita said something that really struck me a bit earlier. She said it would be funny and weird if somewhere in the world we would actually pass on laws to tell men, what to do with their bodies. So I guess in 10 years from now, I want everybody to feel the same way towards women. It should be weird and funny to pass on laws so that women would actually not have the right to do whatever they want to do with their bodies.
I want to thank all of my guests for their contribution today, and that's all we have time for in this special edition. We're going to leave you with some images and also some incredible memories of an extraordinary 10 years where I had the pleasure and the privilege of meeting some extraordinary people. So until our next show, bye for now. Coming to you from Dakar in Senegal. What is your position? We're here in the English city of Cambridge.
Thank you so much for your time.